wanted to share at a conference like this. I discovered I had a lot of interesting topics that had had a notable impact on my ability as a tester, but they didn't fit into a 40-minute time slot. Or they just did not fit into a compelling story that I wanted to tell. So instead, this. And the interesting thing is many of these tips, I've spent a ridiculous amount of time self-educating myself. I have had the luxury to not just speak with, but work with some of the most talented people in the business. Still, many of these are things I discovered a couple of years ago. So, buckle up. And first of all, I have 3 to 4 minutes to talk about each of these, and there is a lot more to say about them. So I very much urge you to go and download the presentation. It will be available on the Nordic Testing Days webpage. For each slide, you have some references, you have additional sources, you have additional examples, comments. So in this case, typically I want the slide deck to just be some kind of support for me talking. In this case, I think it's a very important, useful material on itself, or in itself. Now, let's start. How many in here? Hands up if you know what a risk catalog is. Hands up. A few. A risk catalog is basically a list, a categorized list of generic risks. A generic risk is, let's say we're saving a file to disk. It could be something the user created, could be a configuration file, doesn't really matter, but a file to disk. Typical generic risks would be, what if the file doesn't exist and needs to be created? What if the file does exist and needs to be overwritten or appended to? What if the file is read-only or locked by some other application? What if the user does not have access to the folder? Or what if the storage device times out and stuff like that? All these are generic. They are applicable to any file storage you do. So risk catalog is a list of these kind of risks. The most famous one, I think, is You're Not Done Yet by Michael Hunter. I think that's mandatory reading for every developer, or every tester and developer. I use this, I know some people use this as like a checklist when they actually test. I find that a distraction. You can try whatever you want. I like to just skim some of these lists that are relevant to what I test in between sprints, or when I just don't have too much to do. To sort of build a library in the back of my head of things to test, because each of these risks are something worth testing or something potentially worth testing. And since they're generic, it's pretty likely that you will run into a case where it's relevant. Once again, download the slides, because you have links to this list, you have a link to You're Not Done Yet, and so forth in the notes. Next one, there are a lot of interesting quick tests. I will share. A quick test is basically a test that is super cheap to run and still very generally applicable. You can apply it to so many different situations. And you can find your own. I'll share 4 that I like a lot. And 2 of them are specific for web, but they can be tweaked to fit our context as well. The first one I learned from Joel Redén, tester in Sweden. It's the simplest load test you will ever run. It goes something like this. Done. You simply hold on F5 for, say, 30 seconds or something. And it might sound silly. What it does, it's in a browser, it will create a lot of page reloads. And it sounds silly, but I've taken down 2 databases with this. I learned it because Joel had had similar experiences, so he taught it to me for that reason. I taught it to a few other people, and they had, at least one of them had a very similar experience as well. So it sounds silly, but 30 seconds holding down F5 will ruin some systems, especially in a development environment. I mean, sometimes this particular thing would work in production because you would have some protection for it, but it simulates sort of a bit bigger load test in a production environment, because still, if one user holds down, or if it's 10,000 users accessing the same page at the same time, in this case, you can still find similar errors. The next one is a bit more general applicable. You open a form, any sort of form, and the first thing you do before you do anything else, just press send. And this is just to check that basic form validation is in place, so to get a reasonable error or message back. Or if there shouldn't be any form validation, but you don't get like an empty database entry or something. Also, once again, sounds simple, sounds insignificant, but many interesting faults has occurred by just pressing send before doing anything else with form. Third one, you've filled out the form. Press the send button twice or 3 times. Once again, one of those silly things that tends to generate errors. And the same goes for any action button. I learned this during RST, I think, or I heard about it the first time there. And I think the most interesting error I've ever had doing that was when I tried to create a user in a system. And at that point, I think I accidentally pressed the send button twice or 3 times. And I got a message saying, user already exists. And I went like, someone fucked up, because this is an empty system. But what happened was, it had successfully created the user the first time, but when it received the second one, of course, the user was already created, and that was the only message sent back to the user. Or the first message might have been sent back, but it was replaced immediately, so I didn't see it. Not very intuitive, simple to fix, but simple to find if you just do this. And this is applicable for basically any action button in the application: load, create, store, whatever. Last one, not as general applicable, but as soon as you log out of a web application, just press back a couple of times. Make sure no sensitive information is leaked. Make sure you can't go back to the step when you actually logged in and just press F5 again to refresh or something and get logged in. Once again, sounds silly. Once again, very common error in web applications. There are many more like these, but they are pretty useful. And one thing you can ask for when you meet testers who worked with an application for a while, just ask them for these quick and simple things you can do with the application that tend to create problems, because we have a few of those at every company. These are fairly general applicable, but some of them are very specific and still very useful. Have you ever filled out a form and you saw that, oh, this field doesn't really matter to my test, so you write test, or you write testing, or your name, or hi, or anything that's just not high risk? Hands up if you've done that ever. That's a few more than we have during the risk catalog question. We do this. I do this as well. In my applications, there are like tens of thousands of species of fish. I don't know why, but I always use that. At some point, I realized that was pretty dumb. So I started I started having in a file in the background just a few strings that had some more interesting properties to them. This one is specifically designed for the PHP applications I was testing back then, but it would work pretty fine basically everywhere. At least that's web. But it's a bunch of special characters. In this case, they are designed for triggering specific errors, but just having a few special characters instead of test, at least it adds a bit of risk. And international characters are well known for being problematic to encode, and they mess up stuff in the database. I see nodding. Also one of those things, instead of writing test, write that. You can copy paste it. In the notes, you have a wonderful document called 1000 naughty strings. I think this changed name because there's more than 1000 strings now, but it's an excellent document. Have it in the background. There are also tools that can sort of, you press one button and you have, it generates a new random string based on some properties and puts it into the copy buffers. You just press a button, press Ctrl-V. Or you can actually have a quick key. So you like press Control something and then Ctrl-V and you have your random string based on some properties. My students built a tool like this from the ground up when they were studying, and they had no prior experience of programming, and they did this in a few weeks. So It's not a complicated thing to build for yourself if you need something very specific. Final thought, I know some people add a word like, if there's an address field, they write address to help them know that it maps correctly in the application. You can just add address and then that afterwards or something if you want both the effects. Simple stuff, but it makes a difference. And I was really happy when I saw a colleague do this everywhere in an application recently because I could see they had learned. It was a good experience for me as a coach. A lot of us knows about test techniques. It's not a new concept for most of us. Very few of you in the audience, I'm not going to make you hold up hands again, but have a formal education in testing. When I was teaching specifically at a vocational university, specifically for people to become software testers, it was not first, but it was very uncommon. But this means that many of us also don't know even basics. And especially we might know about them on a superficial level, but we haven't really dug into it. I urge you to at least once or twice do the super tedious, huge spreadsheet where you do equivalence partitioning, you do value selection, you do all this like super thorough. Not because you will do that every time you test, but doing it once or twice will, once again, it will create those wires in your head. So next time you end up with a form, it's like, oh, maybe I should be careful so I don't like try the same paths over and over again. And those things are just built into your head. You don't have to do something to make better testing the next time. It's just, it will happen anyway. And it's true for basically all of these. There are different benefits. These, by the way, links in the notes. These are the 9 common techniques described in the heuristic test strategy model, but I think they're a good start, but there are more setups of collections of test techniques if you want to try something different. Same goes when you for the first time do this super detailed function map. We really map up everything a certain feature or something can do, and you start to focus on each of them. I mean, you do this, but when you do it to this super thorough level, you discover that you miss certain things when you just do it casually. And you start to, once again, rewire your brain. So next time you have to do it fast, you can do it better. Still fast, but better. This, by the way, this was the biggest, I think this was the single most biggest epiphany when I was teaching. I've been working with testing for 7 years at that point. I've been to international test conferences. I met not all the important people or influential people in the business, but a lot of them. And still, I was sitting by my desk and did this silly function map, and I went like, oh. 7 years into my career, I've spent so much time trying to become a professional in this area, and still. To take it even further, we talked about test techniques. SFDPO, structure, function, data, input, platform, operations, and time. It's a model to think about the application from many different angles or perspectives. Quality characteristics are different aspects of quality, different parts of quality that you might want to think about when you test. These are very good tools on their own. A lot of testers use them on their own. A student, not my student, a student called David Jonasson, who was a student for a couple of other teachers in Sweden. One of his teachers, Erik, shared this tip to me that you could combine these models. You could, for instance, combine operations in SFDPO and performance and quality characteristics, and suddenly you went from having a focused mind to like super narrow focused mind, and that helped you figure out even more smart things, get even more out of this. So if you go with operations and performance, for instance, if you do that combination, you would go like, okay, so how my users, how they use the product and in what environment it's used, how will that impact performance? And then you go like, oh, we have very stressed users. They tend to want to go fast with the product. So Maybe I should try to create a script that really runs a whole long string of keyboard shortcuts really fast after each other to see that the application can keep up. Maybe I should try to start a whole like bunch of background jobs in parallel just to see that the system can handle that, because I could see the users doing that. And having that focused mind, not just the performance, not just on operations, but on both things at the same time, once again narrows down and makes it so much easier to come up with those ideas. Thank you, David. This is a big one, so I'll try to stop myself before I sort of run out of time. I think the most important workshop I've ever attended was at Let's Test 2013. It was a workshop on visualization, so it wasn't even about testing. It was a workshop run by Hype Schutz and Jean-Paul Farvik. And among many things, this made me start using colored pencils, which I use excessively now. But I think the important lesson from that workshop was I thought I sucked at doing visualizations. I thought I was one of those people who weren't an artist, who couldn't do it. And I know a lot of people have that conception about themselves. And I was sitting there and I did visualizations. And I did it after like 15 minutes into the workshop. And I came back home after this workshop, and the first thing I did was I maybe did this even at the conference, doesn't really matter. I sat down and I painted the general flow. Like I said, I work at Verisure, so I was working with alarm systems back then, so I simply painted made an image of the whole flow from someone breaking into a house until guards or the police is at the door. And I was looking at the image, and I went like, I never thought about that part. And I kept using it, and then I learned we took models, a model called Stride, which is very useful if you want to get into security testing. And I applied that to my image, and I was like, holy shit. Now I start to understand what I could do, what kind of security testing I could do without really understanding security testing, and it would have been really hard without that initial image. I started creating this is from an application we have, I started creating function maps to sort of try to map out functions. I started creating, I turned a couple of test strategies into mind maps. And that was the first time in my career I could pick up a test strategy when I was actually testing and look at it. I'd never done that before, because when I had these 5, 10, 15-page documents, it was just like, I created it, gone. But now I had a mind map, and I could just look at it at a glance and remember stuff. I could put it up. I didn't do it enough. I wish I would have done it more, but I could put up stuff in my office, and other people could go like, what's that? And we had a conversation. We'll come back to a very specific case about test processes later, but I did that too. And it was, let's say it was mind-blowing, but we'll come back to that. You can visualize virtually anything, turn any document into something simpler. And visualize doesn't mean, here's a pretty image. It might mean a mind map. It might mean a diagram. It might mean just something with a bit of visual structure so that you can look at it at a glance and get some kind of general idea of what it is, which is very hard with a document. If you need help, notes. It's there, some links. One of them, the first one is actually Hype's article where he gave additional suggestions for things to read. I highly recommend that article. An oracle is an instrument to tell right from wrong, like a specification or some expert. If you don't know what an oracle is, it's in the notes. And it's something that every tester should know. But let's take it one step further. Most of the oracles we use are internal oracles, stuff we create at the company. Like a specification, like the product owner, like requirements, like an internal guideline or something. But they're quite biased by each other. So if you really want to sort of evolve your ability to find things worth questioning, things that could potentially be a bug, start looking at external oracles. You have comparable applications, like stuff your competitors do, and learn from them. If all the competitors do something in a specific way, it might be wise if you do it the same way so that customers can understand your application more simple, especially if moving from one to the other. If Google and Facebook and Twitter does things in a certain way, it's probably wise to do it the same way, simply because users will be used to this kind of flow or behavior. An example of that, I had a product owner who he decided to put a send button on the left of a form. He made a mock-up, and I commented that it seems a bit strange, and I couldn't really put my finger. I just didn't feel like how I would expect it, how it should work. And he commented something like, well, it's an opinion against an opinion, and in this case, I'll go with my opinion. And there was some time in between. It was not like I immediately started to do this stuff that I will now tell you about, but over the next weeks, by random, I started to think about it, and I started to notice that in other applications I used, the send button, the action button, was never on the left side of a form. And at some point, I remember why, I discovered I think this was, I was very into usability for a while, so I think it was the guideline on usability.org, which is in the notes. It's a whole bunch of good advice that has to do with usability, and I'm not sure if it was there, but I think it was in that list. They had a comment about where to put stuff. And they basically said, in the Western world, we typically read stuff from the upper left to down right. So things you want to do at the end, send, create that stuff on the right or the bottom. So I came back to this product owner and said, well, I looked at all these pages, Google, Facebook. They always put the button on the bottom or right. And now I know why, and I showed him this part. I think it was from usability.org, but this part, and he said, well, actually, you're right. And he changed his mind by using external oracles. Another one I love is from OWASP. It's a web security forum, but let's consider it a security forum. It's applicable to many other contexts than just web. And they have something called Secure Web Application Standard. It's not a standard, it's a guideline. But if something I find conflicts with that guideline, it's most likely worth bringing up or highlighting to my product owner. And it's something that we might not be aware of internally in the company. So find these external oracles that are applicable to your product. I mentioned the Secure Web Application Standard, and I mentioned usability.org, both of them in the notes, and there are some additional resources as well. Build your own library of external oracles. It's a very important thing if you want to be a really good tester. If you would take, well, testing skill or test skill it's included in testability, but let's say we take the most skilled tester in this room, whoever that might be, on some kind of general scale. Oh, Christian, apparently. So we're screwed. Now, but we take the most skilled tester in this room, and we take the least skilled, the most junior tester in this room, and put them up against each other, and that's Christian again. So Christian is against Christian. In this case, the obvious answer would be that Christian, but the most skilled tester will be the one who is most efficient, can do the best job, obviously. But now let's change it up. Let's say the most skilled tester will be put in front of a product that has non-existent logging. It takes forever to set it up. It's very complex to configure, and there is no documentation or help available. It's basic trial and error for hours. Developers are not very interested in helping you. Same goes with product owners. If there is any documentation, it's one of those that doesn't help you at all. You don't have tools to support the stuff you want to do. You don't have all these things. You're in testability hell. Now we give the least skilled tester in this room an application that has great logging. It's easy to find the logs and filter the logs. There are tools available so you can quickly get started. The application itself is very intuitive, easy to understand. And whenever you don't understand something, there's someone, developer, domain expert, product owner, whoever, ready to help you. You have the necessary tools, you have an excellent test environment, and the quality of the product itself is actually pretty good to begin with. In this scenario, the least skilled tester in this room will be more efficient than the most skilled tester in this room. Testability is extremely important. And I mean, this is nothing new and shouldn't be a surprise to any one of you. However, I see so many testers sitting by their desk, putting another hour, putting another week, another month into trying to test this testability hell kind of application, not really questioning or trying to do something about it. Because it's so hard when you're in the middle of everything, it's so hard to stop and realize that you have this problem. I urge you to just stop every once in a while and say, what is frustrating right now? What is hard to test? And what could I possibly do? What could someone possibly do to make it easier? Those are two pretty easy questions. What is really hard to test and what could make it easier? And then the next one is this something I could start right now or should I continue? Because sometimes, of course, it's crunch time. We need to just put another hour into our testing. That's how life is. But in many other situations, it's worth stopping for a moment and actually questioning if we're doing the right thing or if we should spend some time on actually increasing the testability rather than keep testing. This could also include sitting down, reading about some technology you need, or just have a chit chat with some domain expert. It doesn't necessarily is a change in the application, new software. It can actually just be a conversation, but something to improve your testability. Here comes the thing I talked about previously when we talked visualizations. I think it's 4 times in my career I've been actively or passively part of describing the current test process, how we work right now, at different companies and different situations in those companies. And all those times it's been like, oh. When you start to just visually describe as detailed as you can your test process for a particular application or at the company or how to test this in a specific sprint, first of all, you realize that not everyone agrees that you have one test process. You have a whole bunch of different ones. And it's good to start to align them and realize what some people do well and what things you would benefit of doing different and what things you would benefit of doing the same. The next thing is you will just by writing this or creating this in front of a whiteboard or something, we go like, why do you do that? What is that used for? Couldn't we speed up? Why is there a big gap between those two activities? Why are these people not included in when we create the test plan or something? And it just becomes so obvious when you see the thing in front of you. Once again, the power of visualizations. But we don't do it. and when you actually, in many situations, when you start to talk about how can we get better, the first thing you do is what are the improvements we want to do? And you try to improve something and come up with these grand ideas, but it's really hard to motivate them. It's really hard to understand how to get from where you are today and to this point. And it's very hard to understand, to sort of see, to understand the change, to be able to plan the change if you don't know what you're actually doing right now and if you don't agree that you're doing something right now. Finally, this is a great first step. If you want your colleagues to talk testing, if you want to improve how you work at the company, just sitting down with a few testers, with your team, with one close friend, ally, and just trying to describe exactly how your current process looks, you have a conversation started. You have something to go back to with your colleagues. So it's actually a very good start to get that kind of buzz started. And if you've done testing for 15 years and feel like you have an excellent idea of what you do and what you should do, try it anyway. A few colleagues of mine did it at Verisure. I was not involved at all. They did it at Verisure just like a couple of months ago. And they came back and said, why haven't we done this before? And I went like, I don't know. I would go to a conference and say we should do this everywhere, every time in just a few weeks. And I don't know why we haven't. And I'm glad a colleague initiated that conversation. I mentioned I have been teaching students at a vocational university. They had no prior experience to software development or to testing, at least not software testing. And when I tried to explain test planning to them, it was just so strange and so hard, and they couldn't understand the need for it. They couldn't understand what they were supposed to do. And I had a really hard time actually sort of motivating it or explaining it for myself as well. So I wasn't very surprised that the students had problems. And I was actually called out as a teacher that we don't understand this, do something. And I don't remember why, but we started sort of talking about content that could be interesting to have in a task plan, and it started turning into more and more questions. The student added questions, I added questions. And when the day was over, I came home and I started browsing the web. I realized I was far from first. Minister of Testing, Michael Bolton, Rickard Edgren, Michael Larson had already done similar lists in their own way. And I cherry-picked what I liked from them and created my own list that fitted my context or what I wanted to do and what I thought the students could use. This turned into one of those things that students came back and said, I've used this after the examination. I had companies that asked for it since students had mentioned it at the company but might not have it still. So actually, I published our list, not because it was, once again, there were a lot of people who did this before and did very similar things, but I published our list as well just to be able to reference it. In the notes, you can find my list, my students' list, and the other 4 I mentioned. This is an excellent tool. And I think the most interesting part, there are 2 interesting parts. First of all, this highlights that when you have a test plan document, it's a test plan document. It's not a test plan. Sure, you can simplify and say test plan just to simplify the language, but it's very important. The test plan is the conversation, the realization that there are things you need to prepare and know and so forth. The document is just a document of these realizations. And I find that to be very clear when you use the questions. The second one is, this is a pretty lightweight tool. You can browse through these questions pretty quickly if you want to. And that means you can use it before you start a 90-minute test session. If you have a big document template, you don't want to do that before a 90-minute test session, but something like this can be done before a test session. Or something similar. I use this today, some parts of it, for test plans that basically, it's not a test plan in the traditional sense, it's more a test plan, is this a project worth starting? And it's applicable there as well. It's a pretty broad usefulness. This is tip number 11 out of 10. I won't say anything about this one, actually, but it's a good reminder that we are here to break rules. And I see many testers that don't. They go like, I go like, have you tried to install 4 versions of this? And they go like, but it says explicitly that we should only install 3 and it's only allowed to install 3. Yeah, but what happens? If everything breaks down and user cannot use their computer anymore if we install 4 or 5 installations. We have a problem, even though there's a rule stating that you should only install 3. So try it. There are many ways to apply this knowledge. There are some more examples in the notes, but let's finish with this one. If you want to help to become amazing, there is so much help you can get. When I started out in testing, I basically went from going, is there anyone has ever said something about testing? Because it seems like someone might have done that at some point, until I was accepted at a conference. That took 12 months. And 12 months, it's insane looking back at it. But the reason it took that short amount of time was because I could get every piece of help I needed and wanted for free immediately. I could get free Skype coaching from the most prominent testers in the world for free. I just had to be brave enough to ask them. I every once in a while ping James Bach with questions on Skype. Not coaching in that sense, but questions, because there are things that I can't figure out for myself. And I want his opinion on them, or I have an idea and I want his opinion. And as long as it's short so he can fit it into everything else. He's a very busy man, but he's happy to help. And if you take it one notch down to people who are very well known in the community, but not as known as James, they have more time and they're just as interested in helping. I gladly coach people, but my problem is, or help people, mentor people, but the problem is not too many comes and ask me. Now when I've been a teacher, I have a lot of people who does it because they have learned it's available, but before that, people didn't. You have local meetups in both. If you live in Estonia, you have it in both Tartu and in Tallinn. I don't know about Pärnu. No, but it's not too long of a drive to get to Tallinn or Tartu. If you live in Sweden, every major city has its local test meetup. I know that's not true for most countries, but you have some testers you can meet. And if you can't meet them locally, you have like the Testers Chat, which is an international Slack channel for testers. We have like 3,000 or even more testers. If you want help, you can get help. You just have to be there. And they're not secret, it's just that you have to just look a little bit above your own company to find them. There's a lot more to say, but let's continue. Like I said, there is some more that I will not get into. Instead, we'll wrap this up. Pick whatever favorite you have from this presentation if you want to do something after this conference that relates to the presentation. But my own 4 favorites, to help you a bit. Go back, even if you sit alone at your office, just start to describe how you test. There are so many reasons for it. You will realize you do mistakes, you will find ways to improve how you're testing, you will start to understand what you do so much better. You will be able to argue about why you do things and why you don't do things and what you would like to do a lot better if you have this as backup or to back yourself up. Start with some basic visualizations. Like my first was just to visualize the flow in the product. I know a few others started with turning a test strategy or similar into a mind map, just so to make it a tiny bit easier to communicate to someone else and to make it a bit less scary, because sometimes people are scared by the word test strategy or test plan. If you have never looked at, or if it was a long time since you looked at, you're not done yet, just skim it once or twice. There are so many good things that would just stick into the back of your head. And finally, no more of those. No more test. No more test. Wow, that's a good thing to say at a test conference. No more low-risk input. Basic text files, simple strings. Use the most scary, risky thing you can think of instead. It costs so little, but can add so much to testing. Thank you. You happy, Sami?
So now we have time for questions. Who's first on?
Someone please raise the hand.
Hi, Christian.
You always use high-risk input.
Yes. I know where this is going. Continue.
Are you sure that's the right way to do it?
No. No, but I think the point is question your own choice of input. There are definitely situations where you don't happen to have such file open, or you need to upload a file and you haven't designed something that is more scary than the most basic file you have on the computer. And of course, there are situations like everything where you shouldn't. I think a more proper way would be to say, like, question yourself when you're about to use this low-risk input, because it's typically quite cheap to do it in a more risky way. And after all, we're here to reveal and look at risks. Good point. A request as well. If you have, I mean, these are my 10, and there are a few more, but if you have your own non-obvious tips to share, do that, because I'm sure there are better ones than I have shared here right now in the audience, because you're so many more than I am. So if you don't have a question, come with a tip you want to share with everyone else.
Hi, thanks for the talk, and my question is about visualizations.
Yes?
I haven't gone so far, and I still use plain old text lists. But I see the idea to have additional structure there to help generate ideas and get many new tests and stuff flowing. But on the other hand, maybe it somehow constrains your thinking as well. To have one specific visualization. So do you use actually many visualizations, or do you rewrite them, or how do you proceed? Thanks.
I wish I did revisit them more often than I do. The one I created when I started after the workshop, I used basically the same for a long, long time, and I made a few improvements, but it would have been nice to revisit it. I do use very many different methods, and I try different methods. Sometimes, and once again, very important, like Christian pointed out, sometimes a text document is the best means to transfer information. So it's not necessarily that everything should be turned into visualization. My point is a lot of things can be much more efficient. And regarding the risk of using one and missing information, I think that's a good general comment. Often we don't have time to try tons of different ways to visualize things, but I mentioned SFDPO. I'm sure there are similar tools you could use as when you're visualizing as well, to sort of help your thinking so that you don't focus too much on one particular area. But I don't think that's specifically a visualization problem. I think that's more a thinking problem. But using many different ways, or several different ways to visualize something, might help solving that problem, definitely. But I haven't done that very much now.
All right, a question. What's your favorite aha moment coming from these tips? Like, what's your favorite bug you found and thought, I would have never have thought of this if I didn't do this?
That's a very good question. I think it's a combination of bugs, but I think it's actually that one, the string. I was prepping a very short talk for a local meetup in Malmö in Sweden, and the topic was security testing, and I felt like I know some about that, and I like to talk. And I know a lot of other people don't like to talk, so I should prep something. And this idea came into my head. And the interesting thing was when I came back and I actually applied this more broadly myself, because I had only used this casually before. And I went like, this is broken, this is broken, this is broken. I tested this yesterday and now it's broken. Nothing has changed. So obviously that's pretty powerful. So I think coming back from that talk and trying that for the first time in a more sort of focused manner was one of those. But it's very hard to compare them. I mentioned test techniques that was I can't say I found that many bugs at that point because I was testing a very complete app, but just the sort of ideas that started to flow into my head was like, holy shit, this test technique thing, it's so powerful. Why haven't I thought about this before? So it's hard to compare them, but that one was definitely one of them at least.
Thank you, and now comes the last question, and if you have more questions to Erik, and it seems you have, then you can continue together with coffee.
Hi, I work in agile teams, and testing in agile teams becomes tricky because it's every time we run out of time for the testing. And how to cope up with, a test plan, because requirements keep changing and it just becomes, you keep on updating it.
In that case, I think there's an interesting thing when you look at what's called session-based test management. I'm not going to go into what that is in detail, but in session-based test management, you have a container called a charter, which is basically an area you want to test. Very lightweight, you sort of split a feature into, and this is an area you want to test. And what many people forget is that charter is a test strategy as well. So if you apply sort of like a minimized version of, or a smaller version of the questions I showed you, you could apply that to the charter either when you sort of plan it or immediately before you actually do something with it. And I think that's more important because it's a good point. You want some things to be found early on, but you want that part to be really small because like you said, things change. So you want to know basic things like, will we even have a test environment? You want to know that early on. But most of the things, like what should we focus on and so forth, it can be handled right before you test, and you can do it like a 5-minute sitting, you and a colleague or something, just before you start to test. It doesn't have to be more complicated or more formal than that, and I think that might add more value to it. Did that answer your question? Kind of. Please rephrase. Please rephrase. I'll give it another shot because I realized I drifted.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the question what I raised because, yeah, as you mentioned, we'll have one focus area, but still the things change around that one, and all of a sudden the focus shifts.
Yeah.
And then it so happens, it's like you found a very crucial bug, but it is too late. And then you delay the whole stuff. It's like, then everyone, oh, you know what, you should have done it, raised this point earlier. Yeah. But as it was not in the focus initially, so you never, give so much of importance to it. Yeah,
and a very boring answer is experience or skill is very important. I mean, you learn. You miss a certain area one sprint, and then the next one, and go like, we should think about this time. Yeah. So that's a boring one. But in that case, I think it's, in hindsight, everything is so obvious. Remember that if you missed a critical bug in production, that might have been the perfectly sane outcome of your testing, because it would not have been sane to focus on that thing, even though in hindsight it was obvious, but when you did it, it would not have been a good choice. But it might be important to sit down, say, after a sprint retrospective and say, next time we need to think about this, because obviously this is a problem that could happen again. So learn by the mistake rather than try to prevent the mistake, because that can be very expensive, like you said. You don't really have time to prevent all those mistakes. So reflect, I think, is the simplest answer, and the boring answer is experience and skill. You build that over time. But it's an interesting question. Yes?
Thank you. So now it's time to applause. Thank you, and I hope you zoom back with part 2 of 10 non-obvious tips.
Yeah, there are so many more. I hope someone else comes back and does that. Yeah. Because I've already done my top 10, so someone else is probably more interesting.
Maybe somebody wants to raise their hands and work this evening together with Erik to work out the part 2 presentation.
Yeah, you have a few I didn't take you. You can just start with those, and you have 6 to begin with. Yeah. 4 left. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.